Hi, I'm Michael Appel for BizNews.com. As the potential for South Africa's greylisting looms ever larger, the South African government has been busy attending to a list of, 40 concerns raised by the Financial Action Task Force, FATF. Several legislative changes are afoot to address the concerns raised by FATF, and that's an international body concerned with fighting money laundering and terror financing. Last week, the Helen Suzman Foundation made submissions to the Standing Committee on Finance. The director of the HSF, Nicole Fritz, joins me. Nicole, thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me on.
The Anti-Money Laundering and Combating Terrorism Financing Amendment Bill, it's a mouthful, we'll just call it the bill, contains clauses that would require non-profit organizations or NPOs to register with the government. You've said that this has the potential to stifle your work. How so?
Well, that's right. I mean, obviously we're concerned for the impact on the HSF, but we're concerned for freedom of civil society, non-profit organizations generally. And we would point to the fact that the Financial Action Task Force itself maintains that any reforms or amendments undertaken by government states under review should be consistent with international law obligations. And this requirement of mandatory registration is concerning in that it provides for the potential of government interference, sort of politicization. And in fact, I should note that Treasury itself seems to have recognized and acknowledged that concern and has indicated that it will return to the Finance Committee and indicate that it will amend, that it will proceed on the basis of a risk-based assessment in terms of registration, so not one size fits all, that there will be no mandatory requirement. But of course, we haven't yet seen what the specifics of that proposal will look like, which is why in the submission that we've made, we've said that on the basis of this acknowledgement on the part of Treasury, we think that the bill should be republished for comment, given the potential for enormous impact on the NPO sector, dependent on the type of registration that they're going to require.
You've also said that at most what is required is a risk-based approach that must be adopted. What exactly are you referring to here? Just spell that out, risk-based approach.
Well, it's looking at the types of categories of organizations, right, and what their potential exposure is to being conduits for terrorist financing. So which organizations are getting finances that are not being monitored and overseen by sort of orthodox auditing, accounting type processes. What types of organizations are those that the South African state should be concerned for? That hasn't been spelled out, right? And so I think we need to have a demarcation, or at least an articulation of what specific organizations one is particularly concerned for, that are going to allow for the potential of money laundering or terrorist financing. And I think your sort of common or garden sort of NPO, whether that is a kind of book club or one of the kind of legacy foundations or high profile civil society organizations, given the kind of standards that they maintain, the processes for review and monitoring are generally not susceptible to that type of kind of financing. So what organizations are they that the state has in its sight? Why do they hold out the potential for money laundering, terrorist financing? As I said, it cannot be. I mean, we recognize that there is a concern. Obviously, the FATF has raised it, But then there needs to be a response which is looking to identify those groups which may hold out this danger and this risk, and not be that, NGOs, NPOs, civil society generally, which, as we know, are so hugely important to the health of our democracy in South Africa, be subjected to really intrusive registration requirements that impede their ability to work, and in fact place them in danger of political interference when they undertake work that does not find favor with government authorities.
The Financial Action Task Force report on South Africa was published in October last year. It's taken the South African government a year to suddenly realize, oh damn, we're going to be greylisted if we don't act. Is this problematic to the Helen Suzman Foundation? Are we rushing critically important legislation through?
Yeah, it obviously is a concern, and unfortunately we see this in several spheres where, in fact, government authorities have had quite a lot of advance warning that action needs to be taken, and it is only sort of at the 11th hour then any action is taken. And in this particular set of circumstances, obviously we're having a proposal that would really, as I said, potentially restrict and impede the work of a sector that I think is intrinsic to the health of our democracy. And so if we are going to undertake the types of proposals which are being put on the table, we're suggesting that there must be a significant amendment to them. But even if one's talking about a sort of more considered, delicate, risk-based approach, that is a proposal which requires real deliberation and consideration, and it takes time and thought, and it shouldn't be one which is rushed and so results in an outcome that is not best considered. Because again, just in case there is any doubt about this, we recognize the importance of responding to the FATF's concerns, but not doing so in a way that actually is to the detriment of a large and critical sector of South Africa's democracy.
The left hand doesn't seem to know what the right hand is doing. And I'll explain this. You've made the distinction between this bill and then the draft NPO bill. And there are contradictory clauses, that talk at cross purposes there. Can you just highlight some of those?
Exactly. Exactly. So what we point to in our submission is that you are having this particular bill which is responding to the Financial Action Task Force concerns, but then some weeks later we have noticed that there is going to be an introduction of the NPO bill. And they contain contradictory clauses, one requiring mandatory registration of NPOs and the other which sort of proceeds on the basis of more selective registration. And again, the question that has to be asked is, when you are going to table draft laws that have potentially such significant impact on so critical a sector, you would assume that one would introduce an integrated, streamlined approach, not to laws that potentially hold out, entirely different contradictory outcomes.
And Nicole, I had a chuckle when I was reading through your submissions to the committee when it comes to the registration of NPOs. So 110 days on average is the amount of time it takes the department to register an NPO if you submit your documentation via the postal service. And then 126 days if it's done via the internet. Now, those two just don't make sense, but this talks to a larger problem here in that the act itself, as I understand it, as it currently stands, it says it must be done within 60 days. So the department itself is currently flouting legislation.
Exactly. And so the idea that you would give this particular department even, even if we were in support of this idea of mandatory registration, the department is battling to undertake the registration of those few organizations that is required to register in the current moment. And so it is entirely inadequate to what is being envisaged in this bill. And again, I think sort of speaks to little sort of consideration and forethought as to how this process would play itself out, and a sort of chaotic, rushed process in order to try and meet the concerns of the FATF at the 11th hour.
And lastly, I just want to pivot slightly to touch on the Zimbabwe exemption permit issue. And, for every court case in the country, whether it's against the ANC or against the government department, there always seems to be a civil society organization or an NPO or an NGO that is either an applicant or an amicus in the case. And that seems to be a thorn in the side of government. And I want to quote from a 28 June press statement I'm sure you're well aware of from the Department of Home Affairs. And it says, quote, "There's a disturbing and growing trend by some NGOs to sabotage the polycentric and policy-laden decision taken by government by using the courts. This development must be nipped in the bud as soon as possible. South Africa is now under the dictatorship of some of the NGOs, with some having faceless and dubious funders. Their ultimate aim is to assist in the dislodgement of government of the day from power by all means available," close quote. Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi, clearly not a fan of your guys' work, Nicole. Bring us up to speed on the ZEP issue.
Right. So, yes, only too familiar, unfortunately, with that statement. And it is, I think, hard to believe that it, in fact, is issued by a responsible government minister. The talk of dislodgement of governments and dictatorships, hard to believe that, in fact, what we're talking about is a civil society organization taking a department of government to court, right? And this is how we resolve conflict and disputes in a democracy, and we do so peacefully by using the court processes. It is entirely antithetical to this idea of dislodging government or dictatorships, right? And of course, that's, in that kind of febrile environment where civil society is receiving these types of threats and from government ministries, it becomes, more important that we be appreciative of the risks to the civil society space and sector. And so whilst it might be entirely well-meaning but ill-considered that this bill talks about mandatory registration, it isn't hard to imagine how that mandatory registration might be used in order to clamp down on the civil society space. But just to reference the ZEP matter, right? This is the termination of the Zimbabwean exemption permits that apply to around 178,000 Zimbabwean nationals who have lived in South Africa for now over a decade, perfectly legally. They've built homes, careers, families here. And at the end of last year, they were essentially given very little notice, and there was absolutely no consultation with them in terms of ending those permits, putting them to this incredibly agonizing choice whereby they would either have to return to a Zimbabwe that is virtually unchanged from the country they fled, or choose to remain in South Africa as vulnerable, illegal, and documented migrants. We have brought a challenge to that decision on the part of the minister and the department, saying that if you are going to take a decision of this nature, that at the very least you have to engage in a process of public participation, that there has to be consultation with those who are at the sharp end of this decision. We are awaiting a date for a court hearing. Unfortunately, the court postponed the hearing date that had been scheduled for early October. And so we are now waiting for the court to issue a new date for hearing. And I'm afraid, as I say, we wait on the court, and so I can't tell you yet when that hearing will be.
Nicole Fritz, Director of the Helen Suzman Foundation, thanks for chatting to me.